Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. And tonight we're going to start with Dan Rooney, who died recently at the age of 84. Dan Rooney was a member of the Rooney family, the owners of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He was the son of Art Rooney, founder of the Steelers, and when Art Rooney died, he took over the ownership of the Steelers, and he was one of the most powerful owners in the NFL. He was an icon to Pittsburghers, and by the accounts of my friends who knew him, an awfully nice guy. Here's Sports Illustrated on the death of Dan Rooney.
Pittsburgh Steelers chairman Dan Rooney has passed away at age 84. Mr. Rooney was the son of Art Rooney, an NFL pioneer and the Steelers' founding owner. Dan Rooney is credited with the Rooney Rule, which states that all NFL teams must interview at least one minority candidate for all vacant general manager and head coaching positions. He was the controlling owner of the Steelers from 1988 to 2003 before gradually handing the reins over to other family members. Rooney was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2000. His son Art Rooney II is currently the Steelers owner. Dan Rooney also served as U.S. Ambassador to Ireland from 2009 to 2012.
Here is NFL.com with a tribute to Dan Rooney.
Dan Rooney's influence in Pittsburgh and in the NFL was enormous. Served on scores of committees that helped shape the game and helped shape the National Football League. He was the chairman of the league's expansion committee that added Seattle and Tampa Bay to the league in 1976. He served on the board of directors for the league, the trust fund, NFL Films, and the scheduling committee. Always active, Rooney was a visible presence at league meetings and heavily involved with the Steelers. Here's a look back.
I am most honored and proud to represent the city of Pittsburgh and the fans representing our boss and our friend to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, Dan Rooney.
When Dan Rooney was called to captain, he became only the second son to join his father in the Hall of Fame. The oldest child of Pittsburgh Steelers founder Art Rooney, Dan was born right around the same time the team became part of the NFL. Young Dan and the Steelers would grow up together.
But I went to the training camp before I was 5 years old. When he would take me, he was not a doting father that he was going to watch him. He would let the players take care of it. I would go on a lot of the trips, especially when I got a little bit older, maybe 10 years old, and I would go to away games, and we were on a train then. The players, you'd spend 8 hours with them, and I'd take my homework with me, and they'd help me do my homework, would talk to me and things like that, and I became very close to them.
As Dan grew older, so did his involvement with the Steelers. A high school football star in his own right, Dan learned early about the business end of the game.
I actually signed football players before I was old enough to sign them. I wasn't 21. I'd have to get the coach to sign the player. I'd sign them, and then I'd get the coach to sign the Steeler end of it.
By the mid-1960s, Dan was ready to assume a prominent role in the team's front office. His father gave him more responsibility and some good advice.
Basically, I always felt that you had to be yourself. I think that how he operated was one thing and did it really well. I think that how I operate is different than him, but yet taking a lot from him, and used to talk to him all the time. But I know my father would always say that, do what you think is right. Don't make a mistake, but do what you think is right.
One of Dan's first achievements was securing a modern playing facility for the team.
We came into Three Rivers in 1970, and that was the beginning of the dynasty that lasted that year. And I think Three Rivers Stadium really had a lot to do with that. The idea of a new stadium, a place that you could feel part of and be proud of.
On-field success added to that Pittsburgh pride. The team finally became a consistent winner, and there was no prouder moment than the day the franchise claimed its first Lombardi trophy.
Winning that first one, winning Super Bowl IX, you were really walking a foot off the ground. It really meant so much, and to have my father there and to be with him and all the things that happened, to say it was one of the great moments of my time in football.
Dan and his dad presided over 4 world championships in 6 years. Dan was also earning the reputation as an owner who viewed players as allies and not adversaries.
Basically, we've tried to do things right, tried to treat the players right, letting the players be themselves. I don't see an adversary position. It's never been with me that I'm anti-player. As I got older and got involved, even dealing with the union, Ed Garvey made a statement that the players are the game, and a lot of owners really got mad at that. That didn't bother me, because I pretty much felt the same way.
Dan became a moderating voice of reason during 2 contentious player strikes in the 1980s, and was an architect in crafting the labor peace that followed. Rooney also established new guidelines to help minority coaches who had struggled to reach the top of their profession.
The Rooney Rule states that a team that's hiring a head coach must interview at least one minority.
It is a shame that the Rooney Rule had to be introduced in order for black coaches to be considered, but thank God it was. Because without that rule, without that legislation of opportunity, those men who deserved an opportunity would not have had it.
There was still one piece missing for Dan Rooney. No Pittsburgh team had won a Super Bowl since the passing of his father. But a 26-year wait finally ended when the Steelers beat the Seahawks in 2005, allowing Dan Rooney to once again hoist the Lombardi Trophy.
I've been waiting a long time to do this. Mr. Rooney, this is yours, man.
The Steelers won their 6th Super Bowl against the Cardinals in 2008. At the time, the 6 championship rings made Dan Rooney a part of the most successful franchise in the NFL. But he always put the success of the league first, making him a champion in every sense of the word.
We're going to move on now to Robert Taylor, who died recently at the age of 85. Most people don't know the name, but he is as important in the development of the internet as any single person. He was a nice Methodist boy born in Dallas. He worked for the Pentagon for a while. He was helping McNamara figure out the body counts in Vietnam. And while he was working for the Pentagon, he met such people as Doug Engelbart. We've done his podcast. I refer you to it. And their ideas, along with the ideas of several others, were essentially the foundation of the internet. At a 40th anniversary party for the internet, Michael Hiltzik of the Los Angeles Times wrote this of Robert Taylor. We date the internet from October 29, 1969, when a refrigerator-sized special-purpose computer in Leonard Kleinrock's engineering lab at UCLA transmitted its first message to a twin machine in Menlo Park, California. The message was the first 2 letters of the command login. That was the first exchange over what was then known as ARPANET, which evolved after many intermediate steps into what we know today as the Internet. The ARPANET had been hatched many years earlier in the mind of a Pentagon research official named Robert Taylor. Taylor's name isn't known to the public, but his name is a byword in computer science and networking, where he's regarded as one of the most important figures in the field's history. That's not only because of his role in creating the Internet, but because of what he did after leaving the Pentagon. He moved to Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center, the legendary PARC, where he oversaw the engineering team responsible for such inventions as the personal computer, Ethernet, a local networking system for you non-geeks out there, and the visual computer display. I first met Taylor 10 years ago when he became a central figure in a book I was writing about PARC. He was outspoken, uncompromising, and a visionary, and he showed an audience honoring him that last week at the University of Texas's alma mater. As the chief of the Information Technology Office at the Defense Department's Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA, in 1966, Taylor demanded that computer research projects he was funding around the country learn to talk to one another. Taylor was deeply frustrated that while his researchers were in constant communication with one another coast to coast, their computers labored in mutual unintelligibility. Terminals cluttered his own office, one to interact with his government-funded computer project at Berkeley, another to speak to MIT, and so on. By the end of the year, he had secured a $1 million appropriation for the design and construction of a network that would seamlessly interconnect MIT, Berkeley, and other university research computers nationwide. Taylor foresaw that the network he ordered up would evolve beyond an administrative convenience. In a 1968 paper entitled The Computer as a Communication Device, co-written with his ARPA mentor, a transplanted MIT scientist named J.C.R. Licklider, he foresaw its development into a public utility. 40 years on, that remarkable paper reads like a work of clairvoyance. In a few years, it began, men will be able to communicate more effectively through a machine than face-to-face. It forecast that the network would provide some services for which you'd subscribe on a regular basis, like investment advice, and others that you would call for when you need them, like dictionaries and encyclopedias. Communicating online, it concluded, will be as natural an extension of individual work as face-to-face communication is now. As predictions go, you can't do much better than that, I'll say. I should add that when Mr. Taylor was at PARC, his team built a prototype personal computer called the Alto, and another group added a software system that pioneered the so-called desktop metaphor, where documents are represented by graphical icons on the computer display. That technology became the inspiration for Apple's Lisa and Macintosh computers and for Microsoft's Windows software. The laser printer was also invented at PARC, and besides generating a profit for Xerox, it played an important role in the Office of the Future ideas that were explored by Mr. Taylor's group. In the early 70s, Xerox management allowed Steve Jobs to visit Mr. Taylor's group at the Palo Alto Center, and Mr. Jobs, drawing on the ideas he encountered there, went on to be the first to successfully market the new style of computers. So Robert Taylor was a very influential person. We're going to move on now to Jay Geils, who died recently at the age of 71. Jay Geils was the founder and leader of the eponymous Geils Band. Geils Band started out originally as a blues band, but they morphed very quickly. They were popular between 1970 and 1985 as a sort of high-tech garage rock pop band. They were known for two things. First, they put out some pretty good rock videos in the early 80s, and second, Jay Geils was a guitarist for the band, but he wasn't the lead singer. The lead singer was a guy named Peter Wolf. And Peter Wolf was married to Faye Dunaway for a couple of years back in the late 70s, so it was sort of a marriage of Hollywood and rock and roll. Can't say I was ever crazy about their music, but they put out two pretty good songs. One was a song called Centerfold, which became #1 in 1982 for about 6 weeks. It was from an album called Freeze Frame, and the other was the title song from that album, Freeze Frame. So I'll let you listen to a snippet of both of those two. First, their biggest hit, Centerfold.
Does she walk? Does she talk? Does she come complete? My home angel always flew me from my seat. She was pure like snowflakes, no one could ever stain. The memory of my angel could never cause pain. My blood runs cold, my memory has just been sold. My angel is the centerfold, angel is the centerfold.
And here's a little bit of Freeze Frame.
Stop time hawk from the earth, she's not
That's pure 80s stuff. Pretty much your Jay Geils Band right there. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps, and tonight we're going to close with Brian Matthew, who died recently at the age of 88. Most Americans don't know that name, but to the British, he's quite familiar. He's sort of the British Dick Clark. He's a BBC disc jockey, and on radio and on television, he was one of the people who introduced rock and roll to the British market. For many years, he had a radio program on Saturday morning called Saturday Club, and it featured all the top British acts, and in fact, most of the top American acts on it. Most notably, the Beatles appeared 10 times on Saturday Club, and they would often banter with Brian Matthew, and there are in fact recordings out of the Beatles recording live on Saturday Club.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Father Rachel. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Father Rachel. Happy birthday to you.
Later in his career, Brian Matthew hosted a show called Sounds of the 60s on BBC Two, a quite popular show that featured great songs from the 1960s. And the show included requests from listeners, and in fact, I got a request on once. I even got a t-shirt and a mention on the program. I wish I still had that tape of a mention by Brian Matthew on BBC Two. He called his listeners AVIDS, and he'd start every show with, "Good morning, AVIDS."
Good morning, AVIDS. We'll begin this week with a hit by Motown star Marvin Gaye.
And he'd sign off every show with, "That's your lot this week, see you again next week," closing every show with a great British instrumental by the Shadows called Foot Tapper. For all he did for the BBC and for British music, he wasn't treated too well by the BBC at the end of his life. To pay tribute to Brian Matthew, I'm going to close with a little bit of closing from his last show, including Foot Tapper by the Shadows.
That 1962 top 5 hit by Billy Fury brings me to the end of my reign as presenter of Sounds of the 60s, and I must say I've enjoyed every minute of my 27 years in this chair, and I'm saddened to leave. This is your old mate Brian Matthews saying, "That's your lot for this week. See you again soon."